Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Ana Achucarro. I'm the teaching director of the Masters in Physics. I took over Professor Martin van Exter earlier this year. And I'm going to give you a very short overview of some of the things that we do in Leiden. There will be, you will have time to ask all your questions afterwards. Let me say that I am not Dutch. I was born and grew up in Spain, and that's where I studied physics. And I find it fantastic to be in a place where we go after the big questions, just following, the whatever is interesting and important. Okay. So for me as a student in Spain, it was always remarkable that, in my books, I had all these things that this is just a subset of the things that you are studying in your physics books. And it was amazing to me to realize that all of these things were invented or discovered in Leiden. I mean, Leiden has an incredible tradition of doing spectacular physics and spectacular science. And so it's a very special environment to study in particular. Let me tell you that I trained as a theoretical physicist, and so I'm in Spain, and then I went to Cambridge for PhDs, and I've worked in many countries. But when I arrived in Leiden, this picture is there to meet you, and it's in one of our lecture rooms. So for those of you who are from outside Leiden, I'm sure you recognize the people, some of the people in the picture at least. And for me, I was a theoretical physicist. I had become increasingly interested in cosmology, and by the time I landed in Leiden, I was working in cosmology fully fledged. And so this was a very inspiring picture because it has astronomers and physicists who were working together to understand. I mean, Einstein was coming, had just published his theory of general relativity a few years before, and all the people in the picture were really actively trying to understand how gravity works, what the consequences were, and you know that they are quite amazing. Lorentz in particular was a mentor of Einstein. So this picture was very inspiring in the sense that there was a fantastic astronomy department in Leiden, and there was a fantastic physics department in Leiden. And then we started thinking about how to make the most of this. And we came up with a cosmology masters, which is still there, and which is really a joint effort between the two departments. And I think it's typical of the approach in Leiden, right? The approach in Leiden is you go after the question, wherever the question takes you. And so if the question takes you into astronomy or into physics or into theory or into experiment, this is just totally secondary. We are interdisciplinary. We have very short lines between theory and experiment because we're always guided by the question we're trying to answer. And they're really big questions, right? So in my case, for instance, I've been studying what happened a fraction of a second after the Big Bang. So let me just give you a quick burst view of our masters and the situation here. The three blobs. Can you see my cursor? Can somebody confirm that you can see my cursor?
Yeah, I can see it.
Thank you. So there are three areas of research in the Institute of Physics in Leiden, and so one is biological and soft matter. Another one is quantum matter and optics, things like quantum computers and everything to do with condensed matter, superconductivity, things like that. And this is our cosmology masters that we run with the astronomers. And those three areas, as I was explaining, there's no clear distinction between theory and experiment. The lines are very short, and you have theorists who suddenly set up a lab to understand something. You have experimentalists who joined with somebody else somewhere else. So it's very active, very very interdisciplinary and whatever. Then you have three other things that straddle between these two. One of them is the theory masters for people who are really good with mathematics and equations, and also you need a very good deal of programming and things like that. There are also these two rings around. This yellow ring around is meant to be the three societal masters, which are where you combine research in physics with something like education or business or communication. And these flavors you can do in any of the three blobs, if you want. And then there's another one, which is this inner green ring, which is new. And this is our new masters in classical and quantum information. And here you have a few of the people who are involved. So these people are trying to program quantum computers. This is an expert in statistical physics who is doing, half of the time is doing really theoretical research in statistical physics, in network theory. And the rest of the time he's applying it to finance, for instance, and to economics. This is a particle physicist who is very interested in collecting data, loads of data in the Mediterranean Sea. A cosmologist who simulates the universe in the lab, and a biologist who is also dealing with very large data. So you can see it's a very broad thing. And we also have, these were the three specializations that I was talking about, where you do whatever it is that you want to do, but you combine it with something that is societally very relevant and very important. Okay, so here is the structure of the program at a glance. These are the specializations that I was telling you about. So Casimir is a sort of, it's like a sort of honors program for people who are interested, again, in pushing experiment and theory together, or more experiment, I would say. And the one thing that I want you to notice here is the amount of green in the number of ECs that you have to do. Anything in green is research. And so we are really focused on research. We want to train researchers. These are our masters for researchers, these 5. And then the other 3 masters still have a tremendous component of research. So the idea is that you come here and, okay, you follow some courses when you arrive, and then very soon you join your whatever research group you have to join. And in the research group, you really are one of us. So, I mean, we treat you exactly the same that we treat our PhD students, our postdocs, our staff. We're all, it's very democratic, I think. It's very, very nice atmosphere to be on, having coffee with people who are absolutely spectacular in their science, right? Some very, very famous people walking around here. Okay, so this is, I'll come back to this in a moment, but what sort of research could you find? Weird things, just think out of the box. So we have a group that has an expert. This is a famous expert in high temperature superconductivity and related systems in condensed matter. And this theorist teamed up with a string theorist. You don't get more theoretical than that. And with an experimentalist to try to understand systems like what I call strongly correlated systems. Turns out that that's related to things in gravity, in string theory, has to do with black holes, and it's incredibly multifaceted problem to work on. Here's another one. We have a group trying to understand how things swim, what happens inside cells, and also how bacteria and other things swim in their environments. And so what do you do? Well, you're trying to decide, how much is swimming and how much is surfing, or if you want, how much is physics and how much is biology, I guess. And so what do you do? Well, you start trying to find out whether the shape has any effect, the size has, what is the dominant effect? Is it sort of getting close to some wall? What is it that is making these bacteria swim, and these micro swimmers? And so they started printing things, and we ended up in the newspapers worldwide, which was, just again, follow the big idea, follow the big question, and you end up God knows where. Here's another one. How big can you make a quantum system before it starts acting like a classical system? This is an incredibly profound question. It's very multifaceted. And so what do people do? They're doing experiments in this sort of gray area, and they're looking at calculations and everything simultaneously. And it's one of those things where everything is, You combine forces with whoever you can combine forces with. Here's another example, which is a sort of favorite of mine in the realm of thinking outside of out of the box. That you can actually design materials that react in a way which is different from normal materials. And the question here is, what are the laws that allow you to predict how it's going to behave? And in particular, it turns out that there's a lot of mathematics involved in this, very abstract mathematics that you have to also, or that you can use to understand how these materials behave. And so, this is just I could go on for some time, but I'm just going to stop here and leave the program structure here, so that, just let me say it again. This is a very flexible master's, where the number of ECs that you have to do for the core is not very much. And then depending on what flavor you have room for electives and a lot of room for research. So whether it's in the research masters or in the mixed masters, we look forward to having you here. And that's all I have to say. So I think at this point I have to stop sharing and let Matthijs talk to you. And Matthijs is one of our master's graduates. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing now?
Yeah, you have.
Okay. So now Matthijs.
Okay, just give me one second. This should be so easy. Okay, so I think you should see my screen now.
Yeah.
Are we also seeing Anna still? I can still see you, but I hope that it doesn't stream. Good. I think we are fine. So thank you, Anna, for the very nice presentation. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Matthijs Roch. I am a second-year master's student in our quantum matter and optics track. So I'm a little bit biased towards my own track, of course. It's a fairly experimental track, but it's also a track that touches a lot on theory that really capitalizes on this interdisciplinary thought that Anna was talking about just a second ago. So what I want to spend the next 15 minutes on is just telling you a little bit about my experiences in my second year, which is the year that you do research. And I want to try and convince you that when you come to Leiden and when you do one of these great master's programs, so for instance, the quantum matter and optics master's program, you can really, as a master's student, do cutting edge research while working on your master's thesis. And that's something that I think is very unique and really a very strong point of the way we do things here in Leiden. So before we dive into my research, I think it's good if we talk a little bit about what quantum matter and optics is all about, because I know that's something that not a lot of bachelor's programs really dive very deeply into. And so I'm just going to quickly get a laser pointer so I can point at things. So quantum matter and optics research is incredibly broad. It's about a lot of different things, both experimental and theoretical, but I think what binds us all together is that we all do something on the transition between the quantum world and the classical world. So you've all had courses, I hope, on quantum mechanics, and you know that quantum mechanics tells us lots of fantastic things about how matter behaves when you make it very microscopic. And I hope that you've also had courses on classical mechanics, which is another fantastic theory that tells you very nicely how matter behaves when it is macroscopic. So somewhere in between this microscopic world, which is very small, and this macroscopic world, which is very big, somewhere in between there has to be some sort of transition where a lot of very complex and very interesting physics should happen, because the quantum world is completely different from our everyday classical world. Now, if you do quantum mechanics, then you can have these crazy things where objects are in a state of superposition, which is something that you could never have in the classical world. You could never create a real-life Schrodinger's cat because it's too big to follow these complex rules of quantum mechanics. So this transition between the quantum world and the classical world is something that we are constantly thinking about and doing research about in quantum matter and optics. And one of the experiments I wanted to show you, actually I see that Anna has already used it in her PowerPoint, is this fantastic experiment where a group here in Leiden, they made a really, really tiny mirror. It's over here in image B. It's a really tiny mirror of only like a micrometer across, and it is so small that they could actually do an experiment to see whether this mirror could be brought into a quantum mechanical superposition. So that's just an example of the things that we do in quantum matter and optics. The research that I do is in a whole different part of quantum matter and optics, and it is really about quantum matter. So usually, in nearly every system you will ever encounter in your life, usually when we go from the microscopic world and we zoom out into the macroscopic world, usually things turn classical. Usually things become a little bit more normal on the macroscopic scale. But since the 1950s or so, what researchers found out is that there's actually a whole class of materials that do not undergo fully this transition to classical behavior. So that there are actually systems, really interesting systems that you can make macroscopic, but they still show quantum behavior. And you still cannot understand anything they do if you don't do the quantum mechanics. So a very familiar and popular example of this is graphene, which is atomically flat carbon in this hexagonal lattice on this picture over here. And graphene is one of these systems that you can make really big. You can see it in your experiment and you can touch it, but it's also completely quantum. And if you don't do the quantum mechanics, then you're never going to understand all of the crazy properties that this graphene stuff has to offer. So at this point, you might be wondering a little bit, no, this is cool, and this is really interesting, but it sounds a little bit like engineering. It sounds a little bit like we can make some crazy materials, which are probably very useful. But if you come to Leiden, usually in Leiden, we try to do fundamental physics. We try to answer the fundamental questions about physics. So you might be wondering, why should I care? Why should I care about weird materials with weird properties? And there's actually a very strong reason, and I think Anna touched on it as well a couple of minutes ago, and that is that all this macroscopic quantum behavior and all these big quantum systems, they are fundamentally out of reach of all the theory that we have presently. And the reasons for that is actually quite simple. These systems are way too large, massively too large to be investigated using our current theoretical devices. They are so large that you really have a quantum many-body problem in these systems that you just cannot solve with the tools that we presently have. And it's not even a problem of not having enough students that are doing the calculations or not having enough supercomputers that are doing the numerical work. Now, these problems are so complex that it's fundamentally impossible to even make a supercomputer to say anything meaningful about these systems. And that is why they are so interesting, because they are very big, they are very macroscopic, but there is very little that we can say about them using the theories that we have. And in fact, I always think that this quantum many-body problem, this term, it's a little bit of a misnomer. Just the great thing about these quantum materials is not that they are just normal quantum but big. They actually get weirder as they grow in size. You get these things that we call emergent phenomena, by which we mean that if we make our quantum material bigger, then we actually get more quantum effects, and we get quantum mechanics that we have never seen before in the microscopic world. So for instance, a magnetic monopole is something you might have heard of that we don't have. We've never seen it at the microscopic quantum scale, but if we make a quantum material, which is macroscopic quantum mechanics, then you can actually make something as weird as a magnetic monopole. So this problem of having a way too complex and way too large system to be explained by our current theories, it's not just confined to quantum matter. It's a problem that you also have when you do all sorts of physics. It's problems that you run into when you do black hole physics. It's problems that you run into when you do early universe physics. But there's a very big difference with quantum matter, and that is that when you do quantum matter, you can actually hold your system in your hand, and you can touch it, and you can see it, and you can structure it, you can make any shape you want, and then you can do all the experiments you could ever dream of right here in the laboratory with the tools that we have presently. Oh, and one example of such a macroscopic quantum system is in this picture over here, which is a magnet floating above a superconductor. This is a high temperature superconductor. And you cannot explain why these magnets levitate above the superconductor if you don't use quantum mechanics. You cannot even explain why this, nobody knows presently, nobody understands why this superconductor becomes superconducting. Still, it is a large system. It is macroscopic. You can make a picture of it. You can see it. I think in this experiment, you can even touch the magnet. So it's really physical. It's really close to home, and yet it's very difficult to understand it. And because of that, you can really do your master's research here, and during your master's research, find completely new physics and completely new phenomena that nobody's has seen before. So to come back to the master's and my experiences here. So when you go into the quantum matter and optics program, and when you go into all of the research-oriented programs, you always start with a year of coursework. And that's very important because you have to lay the foundations, you have to learn what we already know in order to contribute to the field. So with quantum matter and optics, you first do a year of 60 ECTS of coursework, just like all of the bachelor's programs that you're familiar with. And in this year, you really lay the foundation of your knowledge. So you lay a foundation of quantum mechanics, you lay a foundation of statistical mechanics, but most of the courses that you follow are electives. And you can really go crazy, or you can really pick an area that you're interested in and focus on it and really go in depth on the physics that you enjoy. So you can, for instance, take in-depth theoretical courses, and you will learn a lot of stuff about modern theory and how you can do all sorts of complex calculations. We also have a lot of courses that are really oriented on research, where the course is not taught from a textbook. It is not even taught by one professor. It's a whole bunch of professors coming into the classroom, teaching you about their research and about the things that they find interesting, to really train you to not be a student, but to really be a physicist. So that's something very important to me. And then after that first year of coursework, you get to do research, which is of course lots more fun. It's where I am right now. And I want to tell you a little bit about the research that I do so that you can get a little bit of a feeling for what kind of research projects students are working on in a master's like the QMO Masters. So my sub area of this whole story is microscopy. I'm working on forms of microscopy. So when we investigate quantum matter, we usually try to investigate it using various forms of microscopy. And these are usually not optical microscopes, but these are all sorts of fancy microscopes that can give you a lot of different information about the quantum material that you are investigating. So for instance, here on the left side of my slide, there's a picture that I personally find really beautiful. I try to use it in as many presentations as I can, because this is a microscopic picture of the conductance of a quantum material. It's an image, really tiny. There's a scale bar over here, so it's 3 nanometers. So this is really high resolution. And what you can really beautifully see in this picture is a wave-like structure, which is showing quantum interference, which is something that, it's very far from home. It's something that as a bachelor student, you think you can never see this. It's super abstract. But then you go into the lab, you make this picture, and you can actually see it with your own eyes. And then on the right, there's another picture of a exotic microscopy that we do, where we make an image of temperature on the microscopic scale, and we investigate how temperature and how energy moves throughout a quantum system. And this is really interesting, and we already have many different microscopes here. We can do fantastic physics with it, but there are still some properties of materials that we cannot access, because these microscopes, they always only measure one thing. So you get a microscope that measures temperature, or you get a microscope that measures conductance, and this restricts you. It restricts you in how much information you can gain about your system. So the goal of my research and the goal of the researchers around me is to design hybrid microscopes, to make new special microscopes that can actually probe multiple variables and multiple sets of physical information at once. So for instance, to make this conductance map and to make this temperature map, but do it in the same experiment. And that would really put us very far ahead when it comes to collecting data about these quantum materials. So that might be a little bit abstract. So I'm just going to give you one example of research that we would like to do with such a hybrid microscope. Something we would really like to do is to investigate how currents move, how electrical currents, like you know from electrodynamics, how these electrical currents move throughout a quantum material. So how these currents move in classical materials like copper or gold, we already know everything about that. It's you've already probably learned it in your bachelor's. They move throughout the metal a bit like marbles move, very independent, very fluidly. But then in these quantum materials, there's all sorts of new physics going on, and all of the electrons are interacting with each other quantum mechanically. So the way that these currents move throughout a material, that is hypothesized to change. And our current hypothesis is that this flow should not be like how marbles flow, but a bit more like how lava flows, like very viscous. So this is something that, it's an hypothesis. There's very little we know about this at the present, but if we can make this microscope, if we can build a hybrid microscope to really image the current flow in these materials, then this is something that we should be able to investigate and to see whether our hypothesis is actually true. So I see that I don't have a lot of time left. I just want to, so this is what we expect to see. But I just want to finish up by telling you a little bit about the skills that you get to learn when you do, well, this says experimental physics. Quantum matter and optics is a experimentally oriented master's. It's not completely experimental. So I just want to tell you about the skills that you learn when you do projects and when you do research like this. And the most important thing that you learn, of course, is experimental work. This is something that you do a lot of, and it is something that keeps you going throughout the day. So here's an example of me, a picture of me on Monday morning, looking very fresh and rested in our clean room, which is a very pristine, very clean room where we can make all of these quantum materials. We can structure them in any way we want. And then there are some other pictures of the really cool machinery that we have to investigate these materials, like very good microscopes or devices where we can cool down these quantum materials, so just a very tiny bit above absolute zero in order to investigate all of their very spectacular properties. Now, I think a common misconception about doing experimental work is that this is all that you do, and that you go into the laboratory every day and you do lots of engineering, and that's just your life for a couple of years. But that's not completely true, because there are many other skills that you learn when you do quantum matter and optics. And I think a very important part of any research that we do is theory and it is simulations, because whatever you measure and whatever you see in your experiments, it's going to make no sense unless you take the time to go through the theory and go through the computational work and see what it's all about. So here, for instance, on the left, we have some of the Feynman diagrams that describe superconductivity. On the right, we have a simulation that I made 2 days ago of the magnetic field in my experiment. And these are really things that you spend a lot of time on, that you have to enjoy if you want to really do good experimental work. And then the last important skill that I think you really learn well when you do a master's like this is collaboration and creativity. Because whatever you're doing, no matter what project you choose or what specialization you choose, you will be doing stuff that nobody has done before. And if you're doing stuff that nobody has done before, then first of all, you have to be very creative, because you have to think of new ways to do things. And sometimes these are very theoretical. Sometimes these are really high tech. And sometimes you're spending a day just trying to pick the correct glue to hold your experiment in place. But whatever you do, you have to be very creative. And you also have to be very collaborative, because these experiments and this work is it's too complex, it is too complicated to be done by one person. So, and this is something that Anna touched upon as well, the only thing you can do if you want to get ahead in this kind of physics is you need to collaborate. And you need to meet up with people who have their own specialities, who know a lot about their field, and who can help you ahead with your research. So this is a picture I took this morning of my research group, which is the group of young arts. having our group meeting and trying to share our ideas about how we can fix all of the experiments that are presently not working. But if I can just take one more minute, I think this is also a very, very important part of our culture here in Leiden, and the way that we do a master's program here is that to ensure this collaboration, you really are made a part of your research group. You don't stay at home. The moment you start your research, you get your own desk, you get your own place on the floor where we do the research, and you lunch with these people, and you drink coffee with these people, and you're constantly in contact with these physicists that know so much, and they have so much experience, and that's a really enriching environment to really learn a lot about the physics that you're interested in. So to finish up, I'm really going over time now. Why should you do, well, quantum matter and optics in Leiden, why should you do any research masters in Leiden? It's 3 reasons. You get the amazing chance to work in a creative and collaborative environment. You get to do cutting-edge research during your master's program, which is very unique, and you get to work on the fundamental physics problems that we are trying to face here in Leiden.